Can you ever tell if someone will go on to kill? It's hindsight 2020, or are some flags just too red to ignore? When Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in 1991, police spoke to some former neighbors from his home state of Ohio and unearthed a long history of disturbing behavior.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
In one instance, a group of boys had found a dog's severed head on a spike behind Dahmer's childhood home. Other neighbors reported seeing cats and frogs pinned to trees and buildings nearby. Dahmer's neighbors kept this information to themselves for decades, however, and these details only came to light after he was already in custody. But these warning signs were nothing compared to the one missed by police in May 1991. That month, a 14-year-old boy named Conrad Synthesamphone escaped Dahmer's Milwaukee home. Synthesamphone was nude, visibly inebriated, and bleeding when a pair of young women found him. Those ladies phoned the police while fending off Dahmer, who insisted that the boy was his drunken lover and that there was no need to involve the authorities. When the cops finally arrived, they simply walked Dahmer and Synthesamphone back to Dahmer's apartment. After they left, Dahmer strangled Synthesamphone to death. When this information emerged, protests broke out. Locals claimed that police racism and homophobia had condemned Synthesamphone to his fate. The officers themselves were briefly suspended, but they continued to defend their decisions in the years to come. In his youth, Ted Bundy felt an apparent need to control and harm others, and he often took those feelings out on his family and neighbors.
There are always more than enough kids around to do something with. They seem to be everywhere.
While living with his grandparents, for example, Bundy shared space with his 15-year-old aunt, Julia Cowell. One morning, Cowell awoke to find the 3-year-old Bundy lifting up her bedsheets and inserting butcher knives into her bedspread with a grin on his face. Cowell addressed this incident at the time, but no one else in the family shared her concern. And Bundy's childhood friend, Sandy Holt, later told the Netflix documentary Conversations with a Killer that Bundy would build so-called tiger traps in their neighborhood, which she described as pits full of spikes and hidden by vegetation.
And one little girl went over the top of one of Ted's tiger traps and got the whole side of her leg slit open.
Bundy never suffered any known consequences for setting these traps, and he soon moved on to more lethal pastimes. There was something inherently unassuming about Gacy that seemed to disarm the communities around him, making it almost impossible for them to suspect him of wrongdoing. But some people nevertheless tried to raise the alarm about him. In 1967, 2 teen boys informed the police that Gacy had plied them with alcohol, forced them to watch pornography, and attempted to molest them.
The face that I saw that night was, I don't know how to explain it. It was just frightful.
Gacy attempted to intimidate them into keeping quiet, but still caught a 10-year sentence on sexual assault charges. He served only 18 months, however, and stepped back into civilian life in 1970. Shortly after his release, another teenager accused Gacy of attempting to sexually assault him. Those charges were dropped after the alleged victim refused to appear in court to testify, which meant Gacy narrowly skirted a parole violation that would have put him back in prison. Even though Gacy had twice faced accusations of sexually assaulting a minor and received a conviction, he wasn't considered a suspect when teens started disappearing in his area. Gacy started killing in 1972, less than a year after his second trial. The cops didn't hone in on him until local complaints led to a stakeout in 1976. The man known as the Night Stalker experienced several traumatic events early in his life. At 5 years old, Richard Ramirez fell off a swing set and suffered a head injury that resulted in several epileptic seizures. While research has linked head injuries with a proclivity towards violence, it's no telltale sign on its own. A more concerning incident occurred when Ramirez was 12. His cousin, a Vietnam War veteran, showed him photos of brutally dismembered Vietnamese women. Ramirez allegedly became aroused by the nightmarish images, forever linking sex and death in his mind. Notably, he later witnessed the same cousin shoot his wife. Ramirez was 24 when he committed his first known homicide, killing a 79-year-old widow. He went on to kill at least 13 people, almost always during home break-ins. He also sexually assaulted many of his victims and left satanic symbols at the scenes of various crimes. In 1985, Ramirez was captured by Los Angeles residents after police successfully worked out his identity.
I am so proud of them. I can't begin to tell you how proud we, all of us, are of the people in this community.
Ramirez died in prison nearly 30 years later. Pyromania is often cited as a telltale sign of a potential killer. And while several known murderers have shown pyromaniacal tendencies, David Berkowitz might be the most prolific of them all. Berkowitz became known as the Son of Sam after he began his spree in 1976. He killed 6 people in total, despite often leaving letters at crime scenes and doing little to evade the law. The police finally caught him after he received a parking ticket near a shooting, and he ended up with 6 25 to life sentences. During his trial, Berkowitz spoke to a psychiatrist for the defense and shared a handful of stories about his youth. He explained that he had set so many fires as a teenager that other kids called him Pyro. Berkowitz never lost his fondness for flames either. He maintained a diary that linked him to as many as 2,000 arsons in the Bronx. At one point, he even worked as a volunteer firefighter, and yet nobody seemed to realize how dangerous he'd become.
How did you feel when you heard he was the man?
I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I still don't believe it.
Born in California, Ed Kemper moved to Montana with his mom and 2 sisters after his parents' divorce. His mother, a heavy drinker, frequently abused and berated her son. Kemper slept in the house's basement, distancing him from his siblings and worsening his grudge against his mom. But Mrs. Kemper later claimed she had deemed it unsafe to allow Ed to share space with his sisters. At 10 years old, for example, he began cutting the heads off of his sisters' dolls. Around the same time, Kemper took his first life when he killed the family cat. Kemper reportedly killed another cat 3 years later, displaying its severed head on a platter. These red flags went unaddressed, however. At age 15, Kemper left Montana, returned to his father, and wound up living at his grandparents' house. He subsequently killed his grandparents and spent 5 years in a mental hospital. And even that wasn't the end of it. On his 21st birthday, Kemper was released on parole and placed in the care of his mother. He would go on to kill her, along with 7 more people, before finally being brought to justice. Albert Fish is a good example of how easily red flags could be ignored in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Fish's parents put him up for adoption when he was just a few years old, leaving him in an orphanage where the young charges were routinely abused. He soon developed a fascination with suffering, experiencing pleasure from both watching and receiving violent punishment. He would take those interests with him when he left the orphanage and moved to New York with his mother. A decade later, Fish began luring children from their homes and torturing them. Self-harm was always a part of Fish's fascination with violence. He later married and had 6 children, all of whom became witnesses and participants in his sadomasochism. He also frequently stabbed needles deep into his own body and lit himself on fire for sexual pleasure. In total, Fish killed at least 3 people before he was captured and executed, although he was connected to the deaths of at least 7 more.